What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Mark Whittaker, and we talk about processes, why they are very often so ineffective, and how we can improve them, data-driven and human-centered. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, why don't you visit workshops.work and download my free one-page summary. And now, enjoy. Hello, Mark, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Miriam. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear more about how to facilitate processes and how to avoid bottlenecks in organizations through automation, hopefully.
Okay.
And before we get there, maybe we can start with a question. Would you call yourself a facilitator?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I would, or I certainly don't. I think a lot of people call me a facilitator, but I think how it transpires is people usually say, "Oh, you're a little different than the people who we tend to work with." And I'm taking that on a positive sort of spin rather than negative, because I think facilitators, or the word facilitation, is still perhaps sort of fits in what I would call an unconsidered need. People have heard of it, but perhaps don't necessarily know exactly what it is. Mm. And I think it probably fits in between sort of two bookends. Consultancy. I think people understand that, and maybe a perception of that. Yeah. And I think people are actually starting to understand the word coach a lot better as well. Mm. So I think the bookends are becoming better known. I think facilitation still fighting for its space in there. But yeah, I usually get sort of called not facilitate, but something a bit different in my style. But that makes sense to me, because I guess if I, coming from a background of consultancy more recently, I always felt a bit uncomfortable with being called a consultant. I'm not convinced as to why yet, but I think it's because people expect you to have all the answers. Yeah. You're the subject matter expert, and I certainly don't have all the answers for sure. But I think my preference, and the reason why people maybe say I'm a little different, is because if I do have the answer, I'll tell you straight away, or I'll give you my opinion. But it's not drip fed, and it's more in search of co-creation. So working with rather than doing or working to. So, and I think that for me firmly puts me in the facilitation space. But also I think this is just a little bit of self-reflection. I think we're actually, as a team, we're quite feminine in our style.
What does that mean?
People have said this a lot, but I do resonate with it. I think it's just the listening and the acknowledgement and the empathy. I just think that the deeper, what do you mean by that? All of that nice stuff that comes with good engagement is definitely a preferred style. That's just been natural for myself. Team. So I'm quite happy with that. I'm quite happy with that. You're different because, but yeah, it's a shame that people don't tend to use the word facilitator, in that sentence.
Yeah. From what you explained, for me, the key difference between a coach and a facilitator is that a facilitator helps the client to walk the way towards a solution that they find themselves, instead of just asking for the perfect solution.
Sure.
Yeah. And you have not released yet, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, the tool vFlow. And when you told me about that, so we got in touch because of vWall, another tool that we might talk about, and that I can highly recommend to the audience to check it out. So maybe you can give us some context of what vFlow is, because I think you can better explain it than I can, and then we can dive into the topic.
Yeah, sure. I think you're right. vFlow as a product has only just been launched. We've used it as an organisation, as an enabling tool ourselves for a long time, but it's only recently that we've decided to share our innovation with the world without us attached to it. So I guess there's a bit of a backstory to this, which in part is as the innovator behind the product, I have to sort of describe a little, I feel, where that came from. So have I always been interested in process? Probably not. When did I become aware in process? Absolutely during my degree. So within my chemistry degree, I was organic chemistry in particular. Guess what? You have to pick chemical processes that do a certain job. And, so the word process was probably the first time I probably heard of the word process, actually, to be honest, in any sort of context. And I guess if my degree was about choosing the right process to get the right end result, that my follow-on education was definitely extending and amplifying that into looking for better ways to achieve the same or better results with different or the same or a mixture of processes. So definitely something in there in those formative years there that I was starting to think about processes, process design, but very much chemical processes. So no surprise when I sort of moved out of my early career from sort of pharmaceuticals into business consultancy, then guess what? Was it that hard of a jump for me personally to interchange chemical processes with business processes? Right.
And I would be very curious to hear from you. So what have you learned from chemical processes about business processes? And maybe then even one step further, as soon as human behavior steps in.
For sure, yeah. So, I mean, for me, the translation is fairly straightforward in that you've got to think right to left, not left to right. We've got to think about what we want to make in a chemical process. What's the end thing? And then there are many, many ways to get to that. But when you apply commerciality, you can't just pick the one that has no expense attached to it, or you've got as much time as you would like to make it. You've got to pick a chemical process that's the most efficient and productive, because that is the point. And it's the same in business. When we're picking a process, we haven't got a limitless amount of time and resource and human capital. We've got to pick something that's not necessarily the best, but certainly the optimum for the business. So chemical processes and nature is all about optimization. And I've definitely sort of seen a clean translation of that thinking into business process. It's not necessarily the fastest, the quickest, the best. It's the optimum, right? Because there are many, many variables, especially when you bring in, as you say, people into that equation.
So how do you then find the optimal process? Because I think in chemistry, I don't know anything about chemistry. I was a very bad student in high school. But I would think that it's more of a straight way forward in a chemical process. So at some point you find out which one is the best of all the different options.
Sure.
You might spend more time in the lab, but at the end there's one solution.
Yeah.
With business processes, there are so many variables I can imagine that would impact the best process to choose, and also organizational culture might be an influence, size, people, all of that.
Yeah, very, very complex system for sure. But I think that's why vFlow was required. that's why it was the invention, because one of the things I remember quite starkly when I was first doing business consulting, and I was projected in as the subject matter expert of processes, okay, chemical processes, not necessarily business process, but we'll have a go. So, but what was really interesting was that I was fascinated in the comfort of leadership teams to change business processes based on assumptions. And if it was to give more credit than just assumptions, maybe they wheeled in a small pool of perceived experts to give their opinion. Mm-hmm. And that was enough to make these huge, sweeping operational changes that affected maybe thousands of people. And it was done with almost zero, what I would call, evidence. So, and this was a big shock in my head, because whenever you're designing a chemical process, you're measuring everything. You're measuring heat, temperature, time, yield, lots and lots of scientific terms. But for me, to change the language to number of people, as you say, the amount of resources we've got, the number of customers we have, it's still a lot of data that needs to come together to make a better decision. So I was fascinated by the lack of evidence. And when I challenged some of the operational teams, said, well, we'd love to get all of that, but there's no way to get that. We've spent forever, entrenched, working with people, engaging with people, getting the real data. And I said, listen to yourself. You're persuading me that is the right thing to do. So everybody knows it's the right answer, but the perception is you can't get at the data, so we won't try. So we'll do what we can with the small pool of experts, with what we know, with what we feel, and that will be enough, right? Because there's nothing else we can do. Well, roll in vFlow. So the design intent was to bust the myth that it is a slow, tortuous, tedious process. Actually, with software enablement, you can get a lot of this data on all of those variables very, very quickly because of the technology. And that was a fascinating sort of pivot point, I guess, for us as a business and now as the tool entering the business world, because it's still what I would call an unconsidered need. Nobody knows they can do this yet. So people are still using assumptions and the threadbare population of experts.
And now I'm curious, what is the data, the evidence that you're actually putting into that? Because when I think of processes, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many different things you have to keep in mind. And then you need to choose carefully which data to throw in, because otherwise your model will indeed become too complex.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess there's two sides to this answer. One's the process data, and one's then the humans that interact with that process. So if I start with the process data first, we're not necessarily looking at every process imaginable. We tend to constrain that to what we call core processes. And what that means is the most observed process, which you'd be amazed, Miriam, is very different to the SOP or the governance process. So what people think is happening all the time is not necessarily the case. So what we're looking for is not trying to map what's expected. We're actually getting data on what's actually happening. Now, that may or may not be the process that the organization wants, but it is the process that's happening. Right? So as long as there's no safety concerns, and it is because teams and organizations, they tend to find the best way of working. And that really is the first big reveal with using the software that we have.
And there are two things that catch my curiosity. One is, you say people catch or they find their way of working kind of automatically. And I assume that their way of working that appears natural to them is not the effective one, because otherwise they wouldn't call you in the first place. Mm-hmm. And the other one is, why is it that our perception of the most important process is so different from the actual most important process that you then identify?
Yeah, and I think it's because we tend to design the processes for the organization in a bubble, and because we're fearful of the complexity that's out there, we can't deal with the complexity. Can we? Rhetorical. So we simplify it, and we pick what we think is the best desired process, and this will do. So that's why we end up with this differentiation for sure with what's written down versus the reality, because you only need to have two stores with the same process and you'll find a difference immediately because people are involved. And the environment has changed just within two stores. So you can imagine how complex that is if you've got 1,000 or 2,000 or across European operations. This becomes quite difficult. So that's the first thing why I think there's a big difference. But then you're left then in a wasteland of operational lack of guidance, where, because it is complex, people tend to say, well, we've got intelligent people working in those environments, they'll figure it out. But we don't give them enough guidelines. So we give them guidelines on what they're supposed to be doing, very little guidelines on how. So as long as you get the job done and we don't hurt anybody or we don't exceed the P&L, then who cares? in blunt terms. So you end up with this huge array of variability, which makes it very difficult for organizations to perform at their highest output rates.
And can it be because experts, or especially managers, they don't like to be, maybe none of us likes to be told how to do a job. So at some point we expect that we are hired to get the job done.
Mm-hmm.
And then if someone then steps in and tells us how to do the job, and then even without knowing our organization, but just looking at the data, who are they and how can I trust this outcome?
Yeah. And, that's the debate we often have, and far be it from us or I to say how to do it. What we can do, though, is to say, look, you're doing this several different ways, and I'm not judging. That there's a reason for sure why those 7 ways are absolutely necessary. But one of those ways is really, really efficient. So, and that becomes part of the reveal again, which is about, you can do it 7 ways. I'm not going to change that. They all seem to work. But one of them is really, really efficient. Now you know that. You can make a more informed decision, still autonomous, still within, you're still an intelligent person. I've hired talent, but now you can make an informed decision. But further than that, those different ways of doing it, we're giving people a large amount of credit that those have been designed by the person. They're very rarely designed because they're usually habitual. They just get the job done. And often when I start working with people and at the start of the day, I say, what's the day look like? Really, really busy, Mark. Doing what? Stuff. Right, okay. So stuff. What does stuff mean? And that's the height of the eloquence of how people in very fast-moving, especially service-orientated organizations, describe their days. So you try and redesign stuff. We can't. We have to empirically quantify some of this stuff. And for me, the translation of stuff is actually just a transient process. It's just a very short-lived process. So we don't call it a process because it's over within a minute. So it's just stuff. But when you start to analyze stuff or these fast-moving processes with vFlow, what tends to happen, and I love doing this, not from an arrogant or egocentric point of view, but having worked with somebody for maybe 3 or 4 hours, I can quite happily start to share with the data, wow, you really are busy doing stuff. But did you know the way that you're doing it or how you're doing it several different ways? So circling back round to the maybe 7 different ways of doing it, the answer isn't, oh yes, I designed these 7 ways for these 7 scenarios. That's never a conversation. It's, am I? Am I doing it 7 different ways?
Can you give an example?
Yeah, for sure. So we do a lot of work in pharmacies, actually. So it's probably one of the fastest sort of industries I know, because if you've ever seen a pharmacist or a dispenser, they're working at the speed of light, putting things into bags, medication.
Especially these days.
Yeah, so there are many different ways, and the simplest example is, there was a great example. I was working with a pharmacist who was, they have to do some checking, as you'd expect, that they're giving us the right medication. So that's one of the things I would expect a pharmacist to be doing. And at the beginning of the day, the pharmacist there were 7 things that they're putting into a bag, and they would lay them all out on their bench, and they would look at each one individually, and then they put each one into a bag. That's great, right? So we're still putting medication in a bag. Through the day, that changed to I'm now holding a bag in my left hand, and I'm picking up the medication in my right hand and putting it straight into the bag as I've checked it. Through to the end of the day, where they had a carrier bag wrapped around their hand, and they were just sort of putting it in even more so they could deal with bigger prescriptions. And when I sort of fed back to the pharmacist, I said, that's all great, you really were busy and your processes changed through the day. Did it? Yeah, because did you realize that at some point you were holding the bag and not leaving it on the desk? Sometimes you were wrapping the bag around your hand and putting it in that way. Oh, I have no idea I was doing that at all. But this was, when we dissected that information, there was a reason why that was happening, but it was all in the subconscious. right? And actually what we decided to do was actually a combination in the end of almost like a supermarket, where you self-serve and you have a bunch of carrier bags in a little holder. So you can quickly put your shopping into the bag and then take your bag away, and there's the next bag ready for you. And this is the same sort of solution that was created from just analysing, the way and how people were doing things, which made a massive difference. You can imagine lots of these activities done every day.
Yeah. And I can imagine that it might be also related to tiredness. In the evening, you're maybe more tired, and that's why you're holding a bag in a different way.
Yeah.
Or you just get tired of repetitive work. So it's unconsciously you bring some variation and joy to your work, although it's just packing bags.
That's it. It's absolutely. And people say to me when I challenge them, say, "Why are you changing your mind?" And it will come out bored. So yeah. Boredom absolutely comes out.
But then I wonder, because this change or to force yourself into a new habit also costs energy and brain power. So to what extent is it easier or is it more costly to actually consciously change this automatic behavior into something that seems more efficient, but then if you distract the cost and the energy it costs to actually remind yourself, oh no, now I have to hold the bag this way and to put it that way, because we are not machines.
Yeah. And it's again, part of it is personal preference. Now that they know one of those ways is faster, they may not change it all the time, but when they do maybe stimulated by a busy period, they'll go, I know, I'm going to wrap this around me now. And I can actually not only do that, but I can share that with other team members. So it's a change for free. So there's that element, but you're right. I mean, making change happen in the habit space sounds easy, right? And it sort of is. As soon as you reveal the habit, it changes immediately for a transient period. And then it goes back quite quickly. So that you're right, there is huge effort required to change the habit for good. Now, two things are with us. One of them is in a highly repetitive environment. It doesn't actually take that much of personal effort to change your behavior because you've got lots and lots and lots. It's absolutely accelerated if you change the working environment, the look and feel. So you can change the habit with a difference in the environment. So instead of working at this bench today, actually I'm going to work at this bench. I don't usually work here. That we tend to find completely helps with the translation of a new habit. Trying to change a habit in the same environment is really, really tricky. It really is.
Awesome. And I love the little nudge, just changing the table you're using. And I can also imagine that in a different environment. So for instance, when we're not talking about a pharmacist who uses or who packs and controls medication, but if we're talking about people who send emails in a certain sequence or send documents to clients. So these kind of processes, or in a recruitment process that is highly complex, even there you might find that people are doing things in a different order, and this can confuse an entire team actually.
It is, and there's a few examples I've seen. The ones I like, sometimes in that environment we tend to advocate checklists. So there's a pre-flight checklist that everybody sort of does, and it's managed, and it has a consequence if you don't sort of do it. So it's just a forcing mechanism. Where it goes wrong is people leave those checklists in forever, and it undermines the change because I know what I'm doing now. Yeah, I'm still being managed. And consequences by following a checklist. So checklists again can help with some of those processes as well. But in the main, all of these things only ever work if we can describe the impact of that change empirically. Which again, coming back around to vFlow, people might say, well, what's the point of doing that? That's a lot of effort for no gain. So we have to be able to put some numbers next to it. Yeah, but it does feel like a big effort. But look what will happen if you made that small change, even though it feels like a big change to you personally, because you do so much of this repetitively over a week, over a month, this turns into hours of free time. So then it becomes a little bit more augmented with an influencing discussion about what do you want to do with that spare time. So, and two things happen there. One of them is people say, well, I now have time for personal development. I need that to be released and baked in by my managers that I can do that. Yes, as long as you can change this habit. Yeah, that all works. So there's that element. But what some people in the main are quite scared of capacity release.
Mm-hmm.
And
they have to do the real work, not only the stuff.
Yeah, we tend to find that people, inertia is inhibited by even the concept of there's 20 hours a month that can be released if I change some habits, even though it makes all sorts of sense, even though the business case stacks up, even though these professionals can see the empirical data. It's not any of that stops them changing. It's the fear of what will happen with that capacity. And I think that might just be the sign of the times, where people feel if I show that I'm not busy all of the time, then maybe my job's at risk, rather than seeing it as an opportunity to add more value to myself or the organisation. So we've got a real sort of fork in the road here, to help people sort of transition, even with all the power of vFlow and the empirical and the augmented arguments. It still comes back down to, are people comfortable with that capacity that we're going to give them?
Absolutely. It boils down to our basic instincts.
Hey, since you are listening to this podcast, I was wondering whether you get enough opportunities to exchange, practice, and experiment with other facilitators. Have you heard of the Never Done Before Facilitation Festival? It's a 24-hour global event that is co-created by its participants and delivered by some of the most popular Workshops Work podcast guests. Visit neverdonebefore.org for more information. Use the code WORKSHOPSWORK to get a 20% discount. The festival starts as soon as you join. Now, back to the show.
And this makes me wonder, when I listen to you, I try to imagine how you go about identifying these bottlenecks or inefficiencies and how to solve them. Would you then bring teams together in a sort of a workshop to map them out and discuss what to do with these extra capacities, or how do you?
Yeah, that's it exactly. So there's two stages to this sort of change. The first bit is asynchronously getting the data for the workshop. So it's all about the workshop, right? But to go into a workshop and try and redesign these processes, you'll end up back where I sort of started, this stark absence of any sort of reality check. It's just a contemporary feeling of, well, what I thought the process did this morning. So getting the data is one bit of it, which is to bring the reality, the objectivity into the meeting. Then we can bring in the cross-section of owners or sponsors, whatever you want to call them, into the workshop. But the workshop's now really different because it's being stimulated by objective data-driven evidence, and it's irrefutable. So, and it's not about anybody's doing it wrong. It's about, this is what we're going to discuss.
This is how we do it. What is the level of surprise when people come in and see the data and see how they actually do it?
It's huge. It's met with sort of horror, and I'm being judged, and that can't be true. But because of the way the data is collected with the software, it takes minutes to persuade people that this is the reality. And usually because we have the people who we collected the data from as anchors. So we say, you were there, it's your data, not my data. This is representing your day, your processes. And people say that's exactly what happened. So there's no amount of anchors for the evidence. But the granularity of the data is important. It can't just be, oh yeah, the guy's walked in and got an hour's worth of data. It's got to be a significant amount of data. And there's a balance, because you can have too much. It becomes, there's definitely a curve. Whereas, too little won't cut it. Too much, you've not really added anything. So there's a real optimization of the data collection. Unfortunately, it isn't that much. It's a week, maybe 2 weeks of data collection across a few roles, a few stores, and it's enough enough, not to answer that everybody's looks like this, but it's enough to give the trajectory. This is pretty much, where we're at. And the shock really is how unproductive we all are. And it's not our fault. We are coming into work to do the best we can. It's not our fault that there are so many things in the way. And what the data does is it substantiates the reason why we're not very productive, because it not only collects data on the process, it builds the data into why the processes aren't working. So an example might be a project manager. Maybe we spend a day with a project manager. And I'll really simplify this for the audience. So, they will lead meetings, right? So that's definitely something you'd expect your project manager to be doing. But they also have to prepare for the meetings. So that's something that's out of the meeting. And they also have to deal with people who don't turn up to the meeting. Now, those three are, depending on how much time they expend in a typical day, week, month, is quite important, because people might think, oh, they're just leading meetings all the time. That's what my project manager does.
The audience knows that it's not that easy.
It's actually the bit where you're having impact. The meetings and the leading is very small. Most of it is in the preparation, and a very surprising amount is dealing with people not turning up or giving me the information that I require. It's not my fault that I'm being perceived as a unproductive project manager, because I have all these other things, but I can't articulate them because I don't have time to measure them, because I have to lead meetings, which I can't lead because I can't get all these things done. So the data allows us to bring into the meeting, this is what our project managers are having to deal with. They're not enabled to have lots of meetings because the preparation time is too long. And then we get into this lovely discussion around, why are so many people not turning up? How do we stop that? How do we mitigate that? That's where the energy goes. Because if I can stop all that or mitigate it, guess what? I have more time to lead more meetings, to cover more projects. But we go a bit further than that. Even within the preparation, we can start to think about simplification. We can start to think about delegation. Because your average project manager probably feels the heat all the time around, it has to be me, it has to be me. Well, no, because a lot of your preparation is probably beneath your skill set and is actually taking up too much of your time. We need to find a delegable resource. And then we get into all sorts of lovely challenges around, how do I delegate? Who do I delegate to? These are all the right questions, right? And then we start to get into, well, what about all this? Well, we can simplify that. Well, how do I simplify that? When can I get this simplification? We get into this lovely, powerful inertia building around the data, because we've got something to challenge, which isn't a person, it's something neutral, and we can attack it because no one's going to get offended or hurt. We can attack it and attack it and attack it till we get to the optimized position.
I love that. I love where this is going, and I am curious about the underlying complexity that you mentioned, because it sounds like a Pandora box that you're opening. You come in just to talk about maybe one simple process, and then suddenly this project turns into a cultural change, because you have to talk about why people are not showing up to meetings and how to delegate. Do I actually dare to delegate? Is it a risk? Power, control, all these kind of topics.
It's interesting. It always starts with a very, as you say, a very benign stimulus. So when we're out collecting data, we not only collect what we see, we collect what we hear. And I love the hear bit. And in fact, I found it's not a common skill to watch and listen. So even though that for your audience, people are going, well, that's crazy. What's this guy talking about? Actually, when you're busy collecting data on what, your hearing switches off. So you have to do both, and it really is a new skill we found with using the tool. But what happens is, and this is my sort of in joke now when we walk into a pharmacy, I'll give it about 15 minutes before somebody says across the airwaves, "I wish I was a bit taller." And it's one of those sort of in-house jokes now, because it always happens, because there's a lot of narrative when we're out in the field, and people aren't actually speaking to anybody. I think it's just a symptom of, I need to say this out loud, cathartic, because just one day, I hope someone will listen and articulate and unravel what I mean and do something about it. And it always starts with, I wish I was a bit taller. And what it is the shelves in pharmacies, because the pharmacies are usually quite small, they have to put shelving up high. But your average person in a pharmacy is usually female, and the average height of a female is usually smaller than the average height of a male. And yet we put in all the medication out of reach. So everybody's always climbing, God forbid, or standing on step ladders, and it's slowing everything down. So the comment starts with, I wish I was a bit taller. And we collect how many times people say that. And it becomes very strategic, because it then becomes, why do we have shelves so high? Who's designing the pharmacies? Who's looking at taking these comments and designing them so they work? And why are we buying pharmacies that are too small? It becomes from a very small narrative stimulus, which is added to the data collection. It gets you into the system as well, because that comment in itself is worth days of data collection if you can corroborate it across the portfolio, because it's a common problem.
And it's a kind of problem that you only identify when you come in with fresh eyes. Because otherwise it's so normal to say that. And I'm sure that in every profession, every office, you find these kind of repeated phrases.
Yeah, I do an exercise if we're training people on vFlow, especially from the client. So we might stand in the canteen, or nothing to do with the work. We might stand in the canteen or the office or the car park, and we'll just do for 10 minutes, we're just going to critique what we see. So I'll be sort of immediately putting down 20, 30, 40 ideas of what I can see could be improved. And the client typically is putting down one or two things. And then we compare and contrast. And you're exactly right. And it's not an exercise in I'm better than you. It's an exercise in we need to learn to be more, to critique what's around us and move past this acceptance of what we think is normal.
And it's funny that you call it critique, because words create worlds, right? And I think you could call it innovation. Where do I see areas of improvement? And I totally agree. It's a skill. It's a muscle we can grow. And actually there's research that shows that children are very good at that. The children are better because they're just more creative. Why is this like this and not like that? Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. And,
exactly.
And still, I would like to come back to one thing that you said, and I would like to challenge it. I'm curious about your answer. That if we bring together the people into the workshop and confront them with the data, then suddenly it's kind of neutral, and we can criticize the data, but not the people. And coming back to your example with the project manager, I wonder to what extent the problem or maybe the data identifies that it's not the project manager who is the bottleneck, but suddenly the people who don't show up to the meetings, or people who don't reply to emails or don't deliver their topics for the meeting on time. And then it kind of becomes, well, it is a finger pointing, although it's totally objective and it's true and it's the evidence. So there's nothing to argue about it. But I can imagine that this can really make the tension in such a meeting increase.
Yeah, and there's a few things in the way that we use the tool, which is an extension to the workshop. It's an antecedent to the workshop. So there's a few things. The spotlight does need to be turned on the right root cause, because what would be sort of the worst scenario is that if tensions are inflamed, we're still pointing at the wrong person. So that's absolutely a crime. We're putting all that emotional effort into the wrong area, right? So rather it is in the right area. But one of the things we do a lot of gamification. And we like to sort of engender that as a concept in the way that we use vFlow. And the reason why we want gamification is we want concepts to stick. And one of the concepts that we like to have stick is that habit changing is difficult and it will revert quite quickly. But also it's, even if the heat is on a certain department, we're all part of a common purpose. It's all part of the end to end. So it's not necessarily it's you, it's that the impact of that process or that activity on the whole, not on this group, is actually having a detrimental effect on the organisation. And it's quite important that we engender that common purpose across this. So even though we might have looked at a pharmacy, we'll still have representation across the whole organisation in there, because we know that we need people to resonate with it's an end-to-end challenge, not a store challenge. And that's quite important.
And I would love to hear from you an example for this gamification.
Oh, that is a longer story for sure. What we do is a little bit of a preview. There's a little icebreaker that we play, which is a very, very small version of the bigger gamification. So the gamification is a half-day sort of workshop, and really at its essence, it simulates real life. So it puts a modicon of pressure, not to hurt anybody or to make anybody feel uncomfortable, but enough that you have to put down whatever corporate hat you're trying to wear. You have to put it down and you have to behave as you, as an individual. And it's really important because in its nature, it's trying to demonstrate and leave an imprint of what a high-performing team looks like and how you get to it. And it's not straightforward if we're wearing lots of corporate hats. We've got to understand our strengths and weaknesses as individuals and how we react under pressure, because the tensions really come about when we're under some pressure. But I don't know you're under pressure, and I don't know now why Miriam's talking to me like this. So we have to understand each other better for sure. But the preview of that is a simple ice-breaking game we call the change game. And if we've got time, I'll just very quickly sort of walk you through. So we literally start with getting pairs of the audience to just stand toe-to-toe, really quite close. So as close as people dare to get. And we ask them to look each other up and down, and we ask them to take in what they see. And then we ask them to turn back to back and make 3 changes. So three physical changes on their person. And they turn back round again, and the little exercise is to just try and see what those changes are. And amazingly, some people don't see what's being changed. So there's something about attention to detail. You might have looked at somebody, but have you really looked? And the analogy in process world is, have you really looked at this process, or have you made a view, an assumption of what this process is, because it's all in the detail. So believe it or not, even with 3 simple changes, people don't get them. They don't get all 3. And it's like, oh, right, well, why? Beyond the joke, there's not much to look at on the human persona. There's not many things you can change. And yet we couldn't get them. So that was the learning point. So we asked people to sit down, and there's 2 bits of learnings from it that really help us. The first one is how uncomfortable was it when you were stood so close looking at the other person? Now, even though that was a personal space, it's the same if you're looking at somebody's world, their processes. You might not be physically close to them, but it feels the same. It feels horribly intrusive. It feels I'm being analysed and I'm being judged, and it's very uncomfortable. So we have to remember that as managers and leaders, that we are entering somebody's personal space, not physically, but their personal world. But the best learning is after a few minutes of divesting what we've learned in the personal space, I ask them how many people have put their changes back. And everybody has put their changes back. So the subconscious has overruled the conscious. So everybody, even if it was just a tie to the side or a loosening of a button, everybody puts it back. And that's the point I was really making, which is when we're trying to do change with whatever stimulus, with data, with agreement in a workshop, then it always is still much harder than that, because the subconscious takes us right back again. And it's a little preview of the gamification exercise where we do it much more scientifically with a better debrief. But it's that feeling that we're trying to get people to think very carefully about. The detail is necessary, and actually the personal space and the habit and the conscious and the unconscious. So those are the sorts of things we do in our workshops, in our meetings, because if I can maybe sort of summarize with this, I'm fascinated with how bad workshops can be if we don't get them right. So everybody will say planning and preparation. Of course, it's hygiene, right? We've got to plan, we've got to prepare. Yes, of course, right? But then you've got people involved. It all goes out the window. So what I tend to say to people, and this is the effort required if you get true engagement, is, especially when you're presenting back data and people might not agree with it, people will give you clues. Their body language gives everything away. And I always say, whenever I start a workshop, even if they haven't, everybody's got their arms crossed. So we have to change the body language through the course of the meeting. It's a separate sort of outcome. We have to get people physically showing us, not through their consciousness, but through their subconscious, that they're committed and engaged with this process. But it goes beyond that, because there's not only their physical arms that need to be uncrossed, we need to uncross their arms in their head. And you can't see that one. so there's more to do than just the physical stuff. We've got to get into that second bit as well, and the gamification really helps us with that.
So I would be curious, also because you mentioned that it's such a vulnerable place to reveal a process and to talk about that. So how do you create this feeling of safety and comfort in these groups that are business organizations? If you talk to management, it's mostly manly, especially in the pharma industry, I guess.
Yeah, well, there's a few things. The first thing is a meeting with any management or any leadership who are attending that this, whatever you're going to see next, is not arming you to do something about it. This is just the stimulus, and that's really quite important. Yeah, well, yeah, okay, maybe not sign, but the point is, it's made very deliberate, and that commitment is almost like Chatham House rules. Is if the leadership have to say that, we make them say it in the meeting. So a public commitment that, yes, this is just a stimulus. Yeah, we know where the data came from, but that's not what this exercise is about. So then the second thing is that the people who've supplied the data, not actively because we work with them, we don't leave the site until they've signed off that data. So, and this was part of the reason why it needed to be software enabled, because if you collected the data in any other way, you would have to leave the site, write it up, transcribe it, and then you've lost the trust because people don't know what you've disappeared, gone and done to do with the data. The fact that when we've pressed the last button on the technology, it shows you the data, and we sit down with the pharmacist, with the project manager, say, look, I'm not sharing any insights yet, I've done that bit, but what I am sharing with you is the stimulus data. Does this accurately describe the day we spent together? And we get that sign off. So when we're coming into the meetings, we have the sponsorship alignment with public commitment that this is just a stimulus, but we also have the people who supplied the data saying, yes, you can use my data, it's accurate. And those two together, we tend to find suppresses any of any of those issues. It's not without issues. I'm not going to say we're perfect, but it certainly depresses anything that we'll see that could inflame in a meeting.
And to ask one question that I ask every guest more explicitly, because you already touched upon it, but according to you, what makes a workshop fail?
Yeah, I think we have already touched on it. It's that the planning and preparation for sure, the hygiene bits, but also the clear expectation of the outcomes. It's that right to left thinking again. This isn't a meander, but also we like to designate a workshop in a particular way. Is this a decision-making workshop? Is this an information sharing workshop? Is this an experience workshop? And we do try to separate them out. So we don't try to muddle them all together, because we want people to focus on one outcome. And the good news is, because we have vWall, we have the ability to separate these things now. So we can use the meeting if it's about solution driving. We don't need to then harass the delegates to come up with a decision. We can allow them to reflect, and not just the delegates in the room, but also the wider organisation with our other software product, vWall, which allows people to anonymously contribute, if these are the 5 projects we want to do, without knowing the detail or a modicum of detail, which one is naturally sort of at the top for you. So we found ways of combining our products to help workshops avoid these failures.
So basically you would separate the brainstorming idea and do this asynchronously beforehand through vWall, and then provide the data to the management team to prepare the workshop and then discuss the actual outcomes of the brainstorm, if I got it correctly.
Yeah, exactly, because we feel that drives momentum. And like everything we described in the podcast, it's all about simplifying, delegating, making the whole thing optimal. And where we can, we should. If we can do things external to the meeting, then in my view, we should. So the meeting is for a very specific purpose, and we now have some great tools to enable us to do that. So we don't have to try and cram everything into 1 hour anymore. We can blur the lines between the traditional meeting, and in fact, it can have a very distinct purpose now.
And especially because I think the brainstorming bit is usually fun, but then you have the introverts who might just need a little bit longer to come up with ideas. And then the clustering bit usually takes longer than expected.
Yep.
And the debriefing on the clustering, which is the actual work, then always gets a little too little time.
Yep.
So basically it makes sense to separate that, especially now that everyone is used to virtual collaboration tools anyway. I guess it might have been more difficult before the working from home era.
Yeah, I think so. And I think if I can leave the audience with a simple picture, the old world, in my view, was a triangle of activity, whereby the base of the triangle was all of this mechanistic work, and the little apex at the top was the actual impact, the decision making, the driving forward. I think now with remote working and the tools that we describe, vFlow and vWall in part, we can flip that triangle. So actually now there's very little effort required to get the stimulus, the data, the brainstorming, the process data, which leaves a lot of time for the humanistic processes, which is around, the collaboration, the engagement, the decision-making, the alignment, all the good stuff that is very, very hard or even impossible, one might argue, to automate. Or even try to automate. so giving people more time to be humans, to be humanistic, but not diluting that human contact with mechanistic stuff that can now be done with some great tools is our view of the way to optimization.
Yeah, and that's what I heard throughout the conversation, that yes, it's the data at the center, but still focusing on the human behavior that is behind this data, and that needs to be changed in order to change the data in the longer term.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly.
Wonderful. If someone fell asleep after minute 1 and just woke up and doesn't have time to listen to the entire show again, what would you like them to take away as a nugget?
About vFlow, or about workshops, or about processes?
We touched upon all of that.
Yeah, the nugget, I think, is, and I tend to use this a lot. I think the more we can generate evidence or data before we come into a workshop is a real win line. So we can focus on the decision making and the alignment and the humanistic processes. And I think the purpose of all of this, why get the data at all? Why counsel opinion? I think are in three buckets for me. Can we do things better? Can we do things differently? Or can we do different things at all? And that's what we tend to keep as our mantra for our workshops. It's really to drive one or all of those three takeaways. And the way that we use our products, vFlow and vWall, is to try and keep having constructive conversations around those 3 points. So doing things better, doing things differently, or doing different things.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time. It was never so interesting and engaging to talk about processes.
Fantastic. Great. My favorite subject.
Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention, as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.